I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do.
Horror has always been with us. I've often said that I believe that horror is the second story that was ever told around that first campfire. The first story that the elder of the tribe told probably went like this. Welcome to all of you. We are family. We are grateful to the animals for food and the earth and the sky. We are strong and we are safe together. However, the second story probably went like this. Stay out of the woods. Don't go in there alone. There are dangerous beasts in there. And by the way, the woods are full of gods who want to trick you. See, the first story brings the tribe together. The second story is the cautionary tale, the warning of the dangers of leaving your tribe. The deep and dark forest is the original home of the boogeyman, long before there were dark closets and basements and that space under your bed. But see, the forest is much more unnerving than those spots because it's not a manufactured or man-made location. The woods are nature at its most feral. And the truth is, they are unbroken extensions of the earth that are all around us, even the earth under the city sidewalks. Take that in. The idea that the forest is separate or a separate location that is known as out there is an illusion. If you think about it, we are never really out of the woods. Folk horror is a subgenre that finds its power in the conflict between the ancient and the modern, and the fine line between the natural and the supernatural, if there is a line at all. Over the last decade, young filmmakers have broadened the definition of what folk horror means, and it has gained in popularity with new audiences. And I was privileged to see the new documentary, Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, A History of Folk Horror at the Chattanooga Film Festival. It is now making the circuit around many film festivals. If you get a chance, do see it. And today, I'm privileged to have writer, producer, author, editor, and horror journalist Kat Ellinger on the show to talk about folk horror and other obsessions. Now, Kat was part of Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, A History of Folk Horror, but she is also the editor-in-chief of Diabolique Magazine. She has also written for Scream Magazine, Fangoria, and BFI. She also writes for Senses of Cinema, and Kat has also written books about the erotic cult horror film Daughters of Darkness and maverick genre director Sergio Martino. Kat has produced documentaries about Hammer horror and even nunsploitation. She's contributed her vast knowledge of cult, experimental, and genre cinema on dozens of DVD audio commentaries. And between all of that, Kat has a Patreon site full of video blogs and essays called Confessions of a Cinema Slut. Kat Ellinger, thank you so much for being on the show.
Hello, with that big up there as well.
I know I like to lull everyone into sleep so that I can quickly freak them out with a quick question. Thanks so much for being on. And, I usually start my show with the same thing with guests. And I talk a lot about the first kiss with horror, which is basically the movie. It may not be your favorite. It may not even be one that you like, but it's the movie that started you down this road to ruin, as we like to say. So what movie was your first kiss with horror?
Oh, God, I've told this story so many times. I think anyone who's hearing it again is probably just like, no. But it was Dracula, Prince of Darkness, the Hammer film, which I saw way too young. My very irresponsible uncle, he was only a teenager at the time. He's a lot younger than my mum, was supposed to be babysitting and had it on a TV or video or whatever. And I was supposed to be asleep, but of course I caught specifically the Barbara Shelley bit. If anyone knows the film, she's turned and she knocks at the window. That absolutely traumatized me. And I was obsessed. I misremembered it. The vampires could turn into mist. And so I spent the next couple of years stuffing the vents up in my bedroom window in newspaper. And my mum would take it out. She'd be like, why are you putting all this newspaper in there? But I couldn't tell her. But that was it. That started not just with film, but also Gothic literature as well. And I must have been about 6 or 7. at the time. And also, here I am, 47 now, still talking about Hammer, still not bored.
Yeah, absolutely. I have the same thing of boring everybody with my confessional on what my favorite horror film is as well. Or not my favorite. My first kiss was Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now, which I shouldn't have seen at 8.
Oh, that's
Yeah, that was the opening
that's
sequence.
one that's going to warp you. That is.
That's why you have me. I thank Nicholas Roeg. Actually, I did thank Nicholas Roeg. I wrote him in his waning years, because I was like, wow, this was an amazing film. And I love that I watch interviews with Donald Sutherland, and he still can't watch the first 10 minutes without having it deeply affect him. And I love that was my introduction, this weird, bizarre introduction. It wasn't Them or something like that. Even though those movies I had seen previously, that was the first movie that owned me. This was the one that was there that I wasn't supposed to see. It was a carnal pleasure in a weird way. It was this thing, a forbidden fruit, right? And I think most of the time, what we are obsessed with, the thing that attracts us to things that are not the mainstream, tend to be things that hit us with a level of forbidden. And I know you have a real passion for all types of cinema and also Gothic literature, which I do as well. But what I love is that your heart, from what I get from your work, is that it belongs to the weird off-center films. What is it that draws you to a certain style of film? Like what makes you look at a nunsploitation film and say, I see an interesting theme here. I'm going to watch all of them, and then I'm going to do a master's thesis on it.
Do you know what? I don't know. It's something I've never really thought about, but I'm not neurotypical. I've got a diagnosis of ADHD. So I think some of that plays into it, because my mind is a strange place, even without all the horror. And I often see connections in things that other people just think, what the hell is she on about? But one of the upsides of this condition is I'm always like a child. And I especially like sensory, anything to do with sensory texture. So it could be color, it could be music, anything that is a bit more. You know, I just want more. So I think that some of that is to do with that, which is why I was very attracted to Eurocult, for example, because, you know, films like Suspiria, that was another one that was a gateway for me. Really blew my mind, all the color and just the fact that it's like an experience, not just watching a film. Stick anything in Technicolor and I'm just an absolute sucker. Anything that is. So I think some of it comes from that, but then also my background slightly later on is from the punk scene. In England, and you know, and living in squats and being around weird artists and weird musicians and just outsiders. And so there's always that sense of the misfit, you know, finding the misfit or the underdog and then championing it. Sometimes, you know, I'll see a film, a director that's unfairly dismissed, like Sergio Martino being one, and I just feel compelled to write a whole book on him, because it's like, you know, I just, not that he needed rescuing, but I just feel like I can't stand this, you know, I have to celebrate it. So it's all like the outsider, the misfit, you know, and not wanting to be bored. And I think a lot of outsider art, it's never boring. At least it's that, you know, there's something in it, especially the more transgressive stuff. Always feels like anti-establishment to me. There's something a little bit more about it. So
I love that. So I share a birthday with Sergio, which makes me laugh when I say, yeah, I think it's like, what an amazing deal for me. But also I love that you talk about the misfit, wanting to talk about that more. That's what I tend to do. People always ask me for what's your top 10 horror films and stuff. And I can't be more dismayed, because first off, I can't really come up with it. There's way too many. But secondly, top 10 lists to me are somewhat self-destructive. They force people to go in a certain direction. And I mean, I don't ever have to talk about John Carpenter. Yeah, I don't ever have to talk about Cronenberg, although I do. But I mean, there's a million people. They line up to be able to speak to it. But Sergio Martino, you're not going to hear that very often. I mean, even Fulci gets more. And so I'm interested whenever I see someone go down that path, because to me, that's what cult is all about, or genre is all about. We want to have this strange discovery. I have the same thing where I was given a set of encyclopedias as a kid because I was grounded a lot. I was in a lot of trouble. And my father realized I'm
smiling because I relate.
Yeah. And so I was given encyclopedias. And the first thing I do is I look up dirty words, and then it takes me to somewhere else. And it's the potato chip theory of where everything that I started to learn made me want to find out something more. So the thing that scared me was Nicholas Roeg. And then I found out about David Bowie through Nicholas Roeg from Man Who Fell from the Earth. And, it just went from there. And everything that I loved, my dad was big into Hitchcock. So that was when I found out that director was even a thing, because, this guy is a what? What's a director? What does he do? And then I found out this stuff. Before I know it, my brain takes me in all of these directions. And so I completely grok what you're talking about there. And I love that you talk about color, because color to me is such an interesting piece to what makes a good horror film or a good film. And you mentioned Hammer. So Kensington Gore, the first time that anybody sees, somebody gets shot in the face, is a Hammer film. And I mean, that's what I remembered. I remember this really weird, bizarre, textured blood coming between Christopher Lee's fingers.
They're like pulp novel covers, really, aren't they? Hammer, just in period, but they're sleazy, they're really lurid, and they were made that way.
Yeah.
Curse of Frankenstein, the first, and I do watch a lot of black and white films. I'm not a color elitist, but even in black and white, you can find so many textures, and it's a texture thing. But the Hammers, to me, they were like all the fairy tale books that I grew up with, because I loved fairy tale and picture books and stuff, just come to life, just more transgressive and with blood and nudity. So they were even more exciting than the picture books, but they're very artificial.
Yes.
And I love that about them. I don't need my cinema to be necessarily realistic. I want to step into a big picture book where anything's possible.
I think that's why literature is so much fun. I talk about that a lot here, that my first corruptor was not television, it was a book, because you could get a book that my dad would think was terribly innocuous, like the book that The Towering Inferno was based on. And it's like lurid sex scenes. Every floor of that building was sex, sex, sex. And so I was like, yes, this is great. My father had no idea. He looked at books like term papers. Everything that you had to do with a book was an assignment. And so he looked at that completely differently. And you mentioned transgression a few times, and gore and nudity. And when I talk about horror on the show, I say that it serves a role in our culture. And for me, it allows us to have a safe handshake with that Jungian shadow. Also, monsters are metaphors for whatever it is that's in the culture that ails us, that we can't particularly articulate out loud. And so when we have that kind of thing with horror, I think that it has a specific use that we need. In other words, horror is not it's not even a choice in a way. It's something that is terribly human, and sooner or later you need to find that spot where you can examine it. So you often examine, the strange sexual undercurrent and transgressive erotic genre films, movies that get pilloried, that aren't taken seriously. What do you think is the role that these films have in culture?
I've always said this, because by trade, actually, I'm a sociologist. That's what my degree was in. I was going to go and be a social worker, and then I was too much of a reprobate for that. So, but I've always been interested in psychology and sociology, and that was my in point. And kind of fell into writing about film just because it was a passion of mine, and I just wanted to start writing, so it kind of happened organically. I didn't ever set out and say I'm going to be a film critic. I don't think many people do, but I didn't do film studies. But the thing that really has always attracted me to horror and comedy, so it's horror and comedy, the two genres where you see society explored our hopes, our fears, our anxieties. You can learn so much about our culture, its beliefs, its oppressions specifically as well. And with comedy, it's pretty much the same thing. But weirdly, they're the two most derided genres of film. And yet there is, even in the most ridiculous Italian sex comedy, you can learn so much about Catholicism and hypocrisy, about marriage values, because it's all in there. And you can find it in horror as well. And I know horror has become more self-aware over the years, but even in really old horrors, you can see it there. And so it's a reflection of us. And you're right, they are the two most human genres, and weirdly also the two genres that connect most with the body. Yes. So horror is about revulsion or shock or fear or whatever. It gets you in, you get some form of catharsis. And I talked about this so many times with my late friend Mike McPadden, and we just started a podcast on comedy and discussed this, Busted Guts, on the first episode. How comedy, it makes you laugh. Horror, it might make you scream or might make you, but it's a purely physical sort of catharsis as well as the big themes. And my issue with film criticism is, over the years, film critics have become more and more attached to the actual experience of cinema as a emotional exercise. You know, in the 30s, for example, I just did a commentary on a 30s film. I'm reading the 30s reviews and contrasting them with more modern ones. And by the 90s, people are like, this is just path. This is just... but in the 30s, they were loving it because it was the Depression. It was designed to lift people up. And I think a lot of film critics today have completely detached from this idea of film as an emotional or sensory experience, because they have to intellectualize everything so they can prove how clever they are, basically. So it becomes cerebral, but film was never that. It was started in the sideshows. And I think you still find that in horror and in comedy, this connection to the human experience. There's all things that gross us out, or we all have very, like you said about the woodlands, we're still there. We still have those innate fears, and it's like a safe space to go in and just explore that. And so they're wonderful. They tell us so much, especially how universal horror is as well over the years. Shows that, even though we like to think we're more civilized now, we're still scared of the same things. It's just certain people don't ever want to admit it, do they? Have to make it something. It's not a genre film. It's like, it's a genre film. No, it's not. It's it's a bloody genre film, and you were crapping yourself watching it.
Exactly. That's one of my pet peeves, talking about, why can't you just say horror? I have a hashtag, just say horror, finally, for God's sake. And I love what you said about comedy as well as horror. Both of them rely on shock and surprise, really. They just have different ways of getting, eliciting the emotion. They're both very visceral. I always say that, if you want to find out what was really freaking people out at any given time, go to the most sordid exploitation films of the time. Go to the drive-in movies. Don't look at the prestige films. Don't even look at the high-level horror films. Look at the ones that are exploiting what you're afraid of. They needed to live off of the headlines. If they could make a movie in the time it took you to read a newspaper, they would have. And so you have that thing where you watch these movies, the white lab coat movies, all about sexual luridness, and then the idea of there was this whole thing of the white slavery that was happening. That never happened, but everybody was afraid of it in New York City at some point, that people were just going to be taken. And you can see these weird movies that there was a long lineage to them until the next anxiety came up. And so I think that you're spot on with talking about that, and also talking about how we haven't gotten very far away from what has always scared us. And I mentioned Kier-La Janisse's incredible documentary on folk horror, Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, which you are in. What's your connection with folk horror? What is it that resonates with you?
Oh, wow. So that film is just incredible.
Yeah.
When I first got involved, it was basically just a short film about blood on Satan's claw. And then it just became this huge thing because we've heard so much about folk horror in perhaps the last decade. It's gained prominence to the point, and I say this a lot in essays, but it's become somewhat nebulous in a way, and it's now like a movement, that embraces art and music and culture and all these different things, which I think is wonderful. But Kayla's work in that is the first actual critical work that I've seen that really addresses the expanse of what folk horror can be and shows that it's not limited to this British experience, which actually ironically was my experience with folk horror, but not limited to just that. Everybody has a folk horror, and the documentary goes all over the world, and there's things in there I'm just like, wow, I didn't know this. I'm just like whole list of stuff that I need to check out now. But my connection to it came from the first part of that documentary, and I think she explores it so well because I felt with the music, and she's got Guy Maddin's animations and this gorgeous soundtrack, which I don't know did the soundtrack unfortunately offhand, but I felt like I'd stepped into a portal into late 70s Britain. It's the same feeling I get from watching Peter Strickland films, actually. I know a lot of people like to think Peter Strickland's a hipster, but there's something really genuine in Peter Strickland. Like, he's same age as me. He's just reflecting all that weird crap that we absorbed in the past. And folk horror, it was two things for me. First of all, folk horror seemed to be everywhere in the 70s in Britain, from the Owl Service, which I saw a little bit later on. I think it must have been the 80s they repeated it. I was a little bit too young for the first viewing. But Children of the Stones, what else? You had all those weird sort of ghost stories for Christmas, the M.R. James stuff. Yes. The Amicus films, it was just the whole, even stuff like there was this program called Finger Bobs for preschool children. Have you ever seen that? That's
only from the documentary. It's insane.
Where you've got this hippie guy with little paper puppets and he's a folk singer. It's like stepping into the Wicker Man or something, Bagpuss. I think everybody in the 70s was like at the BBC, because it was mainly a BBC thing, was some mad pagan hippie from the 60s. It must have been, because it was just so much of it.
I look at what was on that documentary, and I remember I had done a couple podcasts early in this episodes on folk horror. So I did a lot of research. I thought I knew what I was talking about until I saw this documentary. But I had watched Children of the Stones, and I had seen Owl Service, and I was going, wow, this is amazing. If this was children's programming in the United States, they'd have been burnt at the stake. There would be no way.
Yeah, but you lot love the Christian stuff, though. We've been heathens over here for centuries.
Which is astonishing to me. We're finally, some of us are finally getting to that spot. We're still the outsiders. But I think about what we had. We had the Magic Garden, which was two hippie chicks with guitars that had giant owls and giant hippopotamuses and everything. And they had this wonderful garden that you were in, but it was very much tied in with Earth Day. It was tied into with ecology. So it was never brought up that there was maybe a spiritual side to it. It was more like a science thing and more of a down home kind of, we're getting back to the garden. So I love that it was that insane for you as a child. And, I was into
everywhere. It was literally everywhere. The other thing is well, I grew up and still live in the southwest of England, which is where the sort of lost stone circles are. It's a very rural area. I live north of the southwest, but the further you go down south, like Somerset, Wiltshire, you go into, like, I'm an hour and 20 minutes away from Stonehenge. So, I'm 40 minutes away from the Rollrights on the border of Oxford. And even at school, and I always joke about this, but this was an actual thing. I went to a sort of non-religious school, but they'd have the usual prayer and the Christian things, but we'd have May Day. We had a maypole in our assembly, and we would practice what they called country dancing for the whole of April, and then on May Day we'd have a fair where we all dance around the maypole, and it's like that scene in The Wicker Man.
Right.
We had
Wow.
Harvest Festival, we had Candlemas, like, and so because it's quite a rural thing, I sort of grew up around sort of country people that still, like my nan, who I lost a couple of years ago, the most superstitious person, she had a saying for everything, she thought she had the second sight, everything was
right.
but she's not unusual for around here. So somehow those two things were married for me, the culture at the time, and also the fact that a lot of this stuff that was supposed to be scary in folk horror, I was living in it. And it didn't scare me. It felt like home. It felt familiar. It felt magical. And so when I see that, go back to that, it just brings me back to this amazing place where anything was possible, like fairies, anything was possible. And I'm glad I didn't grow up in a city because of that. I grew up weirdly on a British council estate, but we were literally on the edge of town. So a 10-minute walk and you're in the middle of
the edge
field.
of town has always been one of those things, right? I mean, I grew up, it's interesting, Candlemas, all of that I knew about as a kid because weirdly enough, I was on the strange opposition side. I was in a fundamentalist Christian cult that thought the world was going to end in 1975. Yeah. And so we read all about this. This is how the world is coming to an end. Here are the things that are coming back. And they talked about Candlemas and stuff. Now, that was when I was living in Pennsylvania as a child. So Penn's Woods. And I was much more into folk horror than I knew at that time. Now I live in the Bay Area and we've got Morris dancers and all sorts of stuff. It's nothing. It's like, oh, yeah, look at that. Another Morris dancer here. Throw a quarter in the air. It's going to land on them. But, so
I can't believe you have Morris dancers out there.
It's awesome. And I have a friend who has the entire outfit, and it's just it's wonderful. And so they keep that going here. But for me, growing up in the woods, basically, because I was in a city that was a coal mine area. And by the time I'm born, coal is dead. It's distressed. The place is full of depression. And so the woods were actually my place to go. And I was into things like Algernon Blackwood's The Willows and The Wendigo. M.R. James, you mentioned before, Whistle and I'll Come For You. I had read these things and I found myself really enjoying that. And you talk about the rural and the country stuff. There's a documentary that they talk about in the documentary called The Moon and the Sledgehammer, which kind of made my jaw drop because at one point, Kayla also talks or brings the movie around to America and some other places for folk horror. And they talk about the Appalachians, which is where I am from. And so it reminded me of the folk magic that there was in very, very Christian areas. So we're talking Pennsylvania Dutch. You don't get much more Christian than the Pennsylvania Dutch, but they have something called folk magic powwow. They got it from the Algonquins. And so they have this whole thing. It's the same as folk magic, healing remedies, and deep Christian theology all put together. And it almost seems, well, it does. It's purely pagan. If you look at it, it's purely pagan. They just happen to tack Jesus on here and there. But if you're looking at it, you're going, you can see the list of things that are like how to keep people who have a bad attitude about you away from your cattle. This is really insanely specific stuff, not just throat problems and being stung by wasps, but about attitudes and outlooks upon life. You can have some kind of thing. And they have a thing called chocolate alphabet, which is a divination that they do with watered down chocolate on this board that has all the letters of the alphabet. They swirl it around and stuff. So all of this stuff, I mean, they talk about tarot being a way in and, Ouija boards, but the reality is there's so much. And when I went to Ireland, I went to Ireland twice. One of the things that I saw was going to the old graveyards, and you could see the stones that are very Christian, like a child dies. It's like, we mourn you. And it's really, really sordid and full of angst. And then you go to one that has all these stones on it, little glasses of water on it, and it says something like, they are in the wind. You're like, oh, wow. Okay. We have two completely different worlds that are colliding just inside of this graveyard. And what I thought was brilliant about what Kier-La does, she doesn't give us specific definition to folk horror, as you mentioned. She lets the experts give their own definitions, and they're actually like feeding off of each other and commenting on each other, contradicting each other. And I think that is actually very smart, and it allows you to get the feeling of how universal this is. By the end of, it's 3 hours and 30 minutes or something. It's rather long. By the end, I'm going, all right, everything is folk horror. Fine. She makes a very good point about how everything could be. So you also mentioned fantasy, and you mentioned fairy tales, that you used to read a lot of fairy tales. What do you think makes a story or a film folk horror as opposed to a fairy tale or a fantasy?
The folk horror definition is a difficult one. Like I said, it's nebulous, but I think, because in my case in the documentary, I did talk about like growing up, being a witch. I was one of the representatives of the dark side on there, but how that's all kind of connected. And I think folk horror is ultimately, it's about the urban against the old and the primal, the old ways. It has to have either some pre-Christian notion in there, like something in the woods, or with the M.R. James thing, they unearthed some occult claw or ring or something.
Whistle.
Whistle. It has to be a connection to that. And also landscapes as well. This idea of the landscape as a savage force. And I think to townies, they fear that landscape. Whereas I grew up so close to it that I'm really excited by folk horror, but I've never been scared by it in that way, because to me, it just opened up all these possibilities.
I found it strangely calming myself. And talking about the urban is really interesting, because I live in the Bay Area, so San Francisco, rather bustling town. But we have the quarantine. We had COVID. So I would walk the streets at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, no one around, just the fog. And I would be at these places that are just tourist traps I would never go to. And I'm walking, the only person there. And during the day, I would walk and I would see how quickly the woods try to reclaim places where you aren't seeing footfalls all the time. So there'd be parking lots that were sprouting all of this vegetation, all of it weeds, but the cracks, when you see cracks in sidewalks and there's plants coming out of it, right there, you're hearing, you're seeing what is the concept of the woods never leaving us, that no matter how far we try to remove ourselves from our past is right on us like Peter Pan's shadow. It's never really going to leave us. And I think it's interesting. What I love about this documentary is, back in 2010, I guess, Mark Gatiss had the History of Horror, A History of Horror, and he talked with Piers Haggard, who did Blood on Satan's Claw. They talk about the Unholy Trilogy, which is Witchfinder General, Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man. And by the end of that, they kind of said, well, it's a British thing. And I was like, I feel very left out.
Yeah, not. I don't know if I was partially responsible for wrecking the original thing, but when I was interviewed for that, I talked a lot. I talked about Czech stuff like Markéta Lazarova, and Valerie in a Week of Wonders, and also Japanese stuff. A few years ago, I did a big article for Diabolique Magazine on really classic J-horror and how that was inspired by the sort of stories you found in
Onibaba
Hearn, that went back through kabuki theatre, and then it was like an oral ghost story tradition that happened way, way, way before we had a formal tradition of ghost stories. That really started later on for us. A lot of our ghost stories originated with folk tales, but whereas in Japan, in the 1600s, they had, they had the Festival of the Dead. They would gather together and read ghost story or tell each other ghost stories. And so, this idea that it comes out of late 60s, 70s Britain is absurd, because so much horror is actually connected to what we'd call folk culture in one way or another. And especially a lot of those early writers were looking at that. I think there's this idea that, you know, horror is this formal thing, but it actually comes from a long, you know, even the vampire. If you look at someone like Carmilla, you can go back to Lilith and Lamia and the dark goddesses, and you can see the vampire there. You can see the femme fatale there. And so it's an old thing, but for some reason, again, it was like there was this sort of almost shutdown to put it in a box and just say, no, this belongs here, just in this. And it's like, no, it doesn't. So the thing I loved about the documentary is, like you said, every time someone spoke, it opened up even bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it was like a big discussion, which, you know, is totally different to a lot of the ways that a traditional documentary would just have a very core thesis, and people would come, and I know I've produced documentaries, you just have an outline and you get people to talk within that outline. And the great thing that Kayla did with that was she just gave very open-ended questions. What does folk horror mean to you? What would you consider a folk horror? And that just, you know, opened Pandora's box. And to see it, because I didn't actually see it till it just before it premiered, I was just like, whoa. Like, I knew it had been a long time in the making, but just to be able to have that discussion and open it up is such an exciting thing.
Oh yeah, it was brilliant, because in a way, you talked about something that I wanted to get to, which is, it's not really a documentary for all the stuff that I wrote down. And this is just ridiculous, the amount of notes that I ended up taking on that documentary, because I'm watching it at a festival. I'm like, I'll never remember all of this. This is madness. And for all of that, it's not this piece that feels as if it's a textbook. And it doesn't feel like it's this weird, like, pappish documentary that's just kind of the 10 funniest films. It has this weirdness of being its own folk horror, its own folk story. It's a storytelling. It's a campfire tale of cross different cultures and continents. And so it's a discussion that continues to roll around. And I thought that was what was really interesting, is it went back to the essence of storytelling and where these things come from, which is, we have stories that start as ghost stories or folk tales, and then they move out from there. And you mentioned ghosts. Before I get into the ghost thing and the probably the archetype that's even more prevalent than ghosts, maybe, I wanted to hit on Blood on Satan's Claw, because one of the things that I think was very interesting was, in the documentary, they talk about the Wicker Man in a way that I never saw it before. I never saw it as class. I never saw it as Summer Isle is elitist folk feeding off of the people who are lower class. Never saw that.
I've always read it that way, but then Britain is very class based, and I think that was the draw for me as well. Is sort of more pagan traditions. I know Summer Isle is the pagan in it, but he's using the island of Summer Isle for his own thing. Yeah. But pagan traditions were very much still connected to like a working class background. So the people that were working the farms, you know, my nan grew up on a farm. She moved away from that, but you never took the farm out of her. You know, her kitchen was always full of dead rabbits and stuff and chickens, and it was like a weird class thing. I think Michelet talked about this in The Sorcerer, about how in France the pagans remain secretly pagan as a kind of rebellion against the lords. And there is so much class in that. You get this idea, because I come from the country, you know, shit shovelers, that's what they call us. Right. We're the on a par with your hick. And so my accent is a shit shoveler accent, and you get the people from the city, they're like, oh, you know, they're primal, they're a bit, you know, and it is kind of like that, but there's a fear there. And I think the thing the documentary did really well, as it went round, like gender, countries, different folk stories, is those fears were almost universal. They just crop up in different guises.
Yeah.
You know, the shadow in the woods, the wild woman. You know, it's the same thing in every damn culture.
Right. I think that's wonderful. And the thing that I'm so glad that she went across all these different cultures was because I saw limitations and problems with, as much as I love Blood on Satan's Claw, I look at that as a movie about the free love 60s and rebellion, written and directed by an older person who didn't like it, because in the end of the movie, the children are the problem, and in the end, a middle-aged fat guy grabs a sword and he's running around punishing everybody.
I love that film, but now you're saying that, I'm like, actually,
I love it. I love it. I think it's great, but that's the thing that always drove me crazy about it. It was that, and I love that there's that kind of interpretation. You mentioned ghosts. And so I think the only thing that may be more universal across cultures is the witch. The witch may be the only thing that outghosts ghosts, and they're in everything. So let's talk about the witch figure and occultism. And what I liked was how that was brought into the women's suffrage movement in the documentary. So let's talk about that.
Well, there's that as well, and I was glad I got an opportunity to speak a little bit about that, because to me, the figure of the witch has always been one of empowerment, and I know then you had, like, I was in my 20s when The Craft came out, but it's become something else in recent years, and there's this tendency to say, oh, well, that's hipster stuff. It's you know, these silly girls playing with Ouija boards, but I'm just like, the witch figure to me was always enduring as like this archetype of strength. Like, my female relatives would never have identified themselves as witches, but like I said, my nan was what you'd call a natural witch, I suppose. She read tea leaves. Mm-hmm. She, you know, if you were pregnant, she'd touch your belly and tell you what the sex of the child was, and she didn't align with any formal sort of tradition, but she was a witch. She practiced folk medicine, and it was all around me, and these women to me were strong. And what I saw through other media, like books, films, or whatever, is the witch was something to be feared. Mm-hmm. And that's why I've always been fascinated with it, and also folk horror specifically, I think, because we as a culture, obviously not we, are terrified of the witch, because the witch knows things. She has power to change things. There's also that link between the witch and sexuality that they really tried to damp that down through the folktale with the hag. You know, right. Witches are hags. Whereas if you read the Malleus Maleficarum, they were actually going around seducing everyone, cutting their dicks off. Do you know what I mean? And it's like this absolute fear of, and even now, this fear of witchcraft. And the witch, the way we use the word witch, is still that woman's a bit of a witch. It's a slur. But if we look at like I guess America and Britain and most of Europe are pretty much the same, in that we all grew up around Christianity. Even though Britain was a heathen place, it's still Church of England. You know, right. The main thing is still Christian. If you looked at the church traditionally, women had no power in the church. Women had no power in that realm whatsoever. The church was there purely to support patriarchy. Christianity is patriarchal. And towards the end of the 1800s, you had a lot of women embrace Satanism, for example, and the occult as a form of empowerment. And Per Faxneld actually wrote an amazing book on it called Satanic Feminism, about how women embraced aspects of the occult as in an empowering way. And so that's like the enduring thing to me, and I'm so glad it was brought in a way that really highlighted that. You know, why do we fear the witch? Because the witch is free. The witch is a powerful woman. Mm-hmm. Even now, in this so-called liberated era, we're still scared of the witch. Yeah. It's still like, you know, even after The Craft and that, we as a culture, terrified of the witch, and we use it as a way of putting women down, because there is a fear there that the women know, or they have some kind of, and there is not to get too off the point, but there is like a current movement within, I guess, on the sort of outlier fringes of feminism, with books like Rise Sister Rise, which talk about this, the age of the Aquarius, and the coming of this new movement that's not about the patriarchy. It's not really about the matriarchy, but it's about embracing feminism and, you know, shifting things, shifting the balance. So, you know, these are women that are being called to arms. And again, that's a dangerous thing. Well, they've let a few women vicars in now, but it's not the same thing. It's really not the same thing. And obviously, you not all witches are women either, but, you know, it's that absolute fear. It's a fear of the femininity. It's the fear of the witch, ultimately.
I loved how they basically come out in the documentary. I can't remember who says it, but they said, well, the idea of occultism coming up at the same time as the women's suffrage movement makes all the sense in the world, because women finally get to be priests. For the first time, they get to be holding a position of power or a position of strength. Their word means something. And so they're like, all the early occultists are women. And
you get like Moina Mathers, Madame Blavatsky. I don't know. I think I mentioned Blavatsky on there. Yeah. You know, this woman starts her own like whole thing. She's not just the priest. She is the you know, at the top. And that's the first time since the Christian tradition took off. The women actually had that power within the community, because they'd had to live as outsiders. If you look at what the Christianity did to paganism throughout the witch trials, you know, it was a persecution. It was, you know, genocide of a complete people, where women, and especially older women, had power within their community, and that was just completely demolished by that. So suffrage and occultism do come up at the same time, because women are suddenly walking away from the church and finding a new way to do things, and they start by rituals and, you know, which I just think we hear so much about Gerald Gardner, but, you know, it's like the women were the ones who were really kicking ass.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, too, that you talk about kind of like a cultural genocide or a societal genocide that was happening against witches. And I think one of the things that came to me while I was watching the documentary was how there's Native American folk horror, there's Black folk horror, there's international versions of it. And so often, many of the things that we consider storytelling were escapes from an oppression or escapes from pain. The songs that were sung in the South were not happy songs, you know, and so also the folk tales, the fairy tales, many times come from that, and so I thought that was very interesting, and how also we are never, it's once again a reminder that the woods are never far from us. Like you mentioned how your grandmother was not a witch, but she may as well have been one. I grew up around hunters that, as far as I was concerned, the way that they hunted, there were always the yahoos at the beer cans. But then there were people that I knew who would take their clothes and bury them a month before they were going to go out and hunt. So that would get the scent, and they would only go out with one bullet, and they knew everything about the animal, and they would process every piece of it, and it would become as if a ritual. And those folks, if I told them that they were pagan, they'd have cut me up and fed me.
My nan wouldn't have liked being called a witch, but
right. So and firefighters, many firefighters have a belief in fire that is this isn't an elemental. This is something that's conjured. That's the same fire. We've been fighting this fire for a long time. And I love that that's never far away. What do you think of, I know we're running low on time, so I wanted to turn it back to you and say, if you had a few folk horror films that you think would really expand people's minds on what they think folk horror is, what ones would you suggest?
Oh, wow. That's a difficult one, isn't it?
Right. Well, let's pick your new wave folk horror. You mentioned earlier.
I like I love a lot of Czech stuff. So the Czech films, Valerie and Her Weaker Wonders, I think, which was Netzval's sort of novella, which was like an ode to Gothic, but it's really not. It's more like a folk horror with vampires and all sorts of other stuff. But you've got this conflict between the church and the older world in that. So definitely Valerie in A Week of Wonders. To me, one of the ultimate folk horror fairy tales is The Company of Wolves, which I talk about constantly. Angela Carter's fiction was all about that archetype of the wild woman, becoming the wild woman, coming into that power, because in her rewriting of Little Red Riding Hood, which she did many times over her career, but that film sort of pulls together a lot of those stories, was all about women not fearing the beast but becoming the beast. Becoming the beast is the way that you get free. And I was really lucky to see that when I was about 11 or 12, and my mum, it had just come out, so I was 11 when it came out, I think. It hadn't long come out on video, and my mum was like, you have to watch this. And that changed everything for me. The way I read fairy tales and the way I responded to certain types of horror and everything. The whole time I'm now looking for these archetypes. And so that one I think is really expansive. It doesn't always get classed as folk horror, but it's totally folk horror. It's all about Little Red Riding Hood going into the woods. It's a werewolf tale. It's
right.
Little Red Riding Hood, and she chooses to become the wolf at the end, which is like the wolf for Angela Carter was purely a libidinal, magical creature. So it's very tied to sex. So I'd say that one definitely. I would also say something like Picnic at Hanging Rock.
Yes, I love it.
Which is
I was so happy that they brought that up in the documentary.
Yeah, which I've just done something on that recently, which hasn't been announced yet for a publication, but all about how that is really like a variation of Little Red Riding Hood, and it's Don't Stray from the Path.
Yeah.
And the way that I've always read that film, without giving spoilers, it's about a group of girls, the turn of the century, they go up to the Hanging Rock picnic and they disappear. I've always read that film, and I think it's in there deliberately by Weir. And when I wrote about it, I argued why I think it's now, not just sketching it. There's this sense of empowerment and liberation that they're going towards something in those stones, like something old, like a god or something. But it's all about, the landscape, that primal landscape. Yes. And again, townies coming into that prime and then just being completely affected by it. Yeah. Just totally. Yeah, that Bergman's Hour of the Wolf as well, which I did a whole thing for BFI on how Bergman was an early progenitor for folk horror in a few of his films, because, he lived on an island. He was so connected to the land. Yeah. And there was that documentary they did at the end of his life. I can't remember what it's called, but it's brilliant. And he talks about his demons as if they're entities that are with him, and how he walks in the woods every morning to free himself. And I think he was very, very in tune to like this old pagan way. But Hour of the Wolf, which is probably the closest he gets to a horror film, when Max von Sydow moves to this island and he starts to hallucinate and all this. And even Hour of the Wolf, I think, comes from a folk story that Bergman was told. So that, I'd say that would totally expand your mind.
I love that. And Seventh Seal is one that I also
Seventh Seal, it's a total folk horror. I mean, he did a few that even The Magician has got aspects of folk horror. And I don't think, because Bergman was just doing Bergman, but I think that was so much part of him, those folk stories and those fears and his deep, profound connection to the land, that it's in some of his films, and he wasn't a happy guy, so it comes more on the horror end than people on these islands all enjoying themselves.
So you mentioned early on, it was something that I was going to bring up, that in the last decade, it seems as if we've really had a resurgence and an expansion on what folk horror is. Why do you think there's been such a connection, a moving towards folk horror, even when it's things like Ben Wheatley, but there's even Ireland's been nothing but movies.
I don't know. I think some of it is people like Ben Wheatley, people like Peter Strickland, although Strickland doesn't specifically make folk horror. You know, you can see that weird stuff from the 70s in it. And so a lot of those people who are around my age, sort of mid-40s to mid-50s, are kind of coming of age now, and they're putting that specifically into their work because that's where their inspiration comes from. So I don't think anyone is like consciously set out to say we're going to revive folk horror. I think that just happened. But I don't know. I think culture's changed as well. I think people are moving away more from the sort of accepted conformity of religion to find new things. I mean, even in the mainstream, you know, there's people are doing yoga, they're doing meditation, they're doing shamanic drumming to chill out. And so I think there's more of an acceptance for it now these days. It's like, you know, this weird sort of culture movement. And it's happening in music as well. There's like a parallel. A lot of these bands that are what I'd call folk horror bands, if that's even a genre.
Dark pagan,
but, you know,
dark pagan.
Yeah.
I've been listening to tons of dark pagan recently, which is a lot of fun. I will say that I kind of agree with you, and I think that we're going to find out why. Because as I mentioned before, if you want to find out what was really bothering people in any decade, watch the exploitation films of the time. I think kind of like what Tobe Hooper said, because you can make a movie and you may not know what it's all about for 20 years. Because it's hitting on an unconscious, subconscious level. There's
a reason it's come back, and it's come back over the last decade or so. First of all, there seemed to be a resurgence in interest in the older stuff, and then newer stuff coming out from that. But like you said, it's a reflection of something. And I did actually see, I was lucky to see a film called Glass House, which is going to premiere at Fantasia Festival. I did the little blurb for the website, and I'd call that a dystopian folk horror and urge everyone to check that out, because you can see in that this is pandemic fears in the land, you know. And I won't give too much away, but I just total folk horror vibe from that one, and very unique film in that as well. Very beautiful film as well. It's all filmed in South Africa by a female director, Kelsey Egan. So, and I think it's her first feature length. But I think we're going to be seeing more of that. I mean, The Witch, which personally I didn't like because I didn't think they were living deliciously enough. But
right. I get you on that. It was directed by Tinto Brass. It might have been better.
We needed Tinto Brass's The Witch. But no, it's the same sort of vibe in there. This thing of going into this place, and I'd love to know what's actually under it. What's actually fueling that. Like, to me, I'm like, it's come home. I'm just
right.
More.
That's wonderful. And that's a great place for us to be able to have a stop here. Thank you so much, Kat, for being on. And thank you for being on the show. Is there any where that people can take a look at more of your work? Do you have any new projects that are about to drop that you'd like to discuss right now?
Oh, yes. So you can catch me on Patreon, Kat Ellinger's Confessions of a Cine Slut. Also at Diabolique Magazine, a lot of my stuff is on there. And talking of fairy tales, I've been branching into erotic fairy tales.
We need to talk more.
Which you can find, which I'll have to come back again.
Yes.
And talk about that. As a series called Chamber of Beasts, which are inspired by people like Angela Carter and Valerian Borowczyk's films, mainly about women sort of embracing that animality. They're in the section of Amazon that gets no promotion under the title Kitty Fassbinder is my pseudonym there. I've done 2 so far on Kindle, The Carnal Canvas and The Delicious Awakenings of Red and the Wolf, which is my own retelling of of Little Red Riding Hood. But yeah, I got some folk horror-y ones planned as well, because I think it's all connected.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all of that.
Thank you.
I also want to thank everybody who's out there who's listening to Hellbent for Horror, where I'm here to remind you that you used to love horror films and you secretly still do. And I just want to remind you to stay hellbent. And we're out.
Yeah. Oh, that was great. Thank you. I will have to come back. So.
Yes, please. I would love to have you. I wish I could go another a while. Let's just put it that way.
And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.